the difference between Asian indirectness and corporate America indirectness? This is a question that I am asked all the time because I'm Dr. K. I research the unwritten rules of work for the working class and neurodivergence. And one of the unwritten rules is that as you move up higher on the ladder, as you experience career mobility and social class mobility, you will be in circles where everyone seems to be talking around in circles. And so I call this the unwritten rule of indirect communication. But it is not completely the same as when we think of high context versus low context cultures. So I'm going to talk about this while I get ready for my book club, where we are going to be discussing probably some of this as we just read Erin Meyer's book, The Culture Map. I will preface this by saying that all of the social class research that I'm about to tell you is from my own research and my lived experience, but I'm not of Asian descent and I haven't visited Asia yet. I'll be going there in March, but all of this would be book learning as we say where I'm from. So if you are from this culture, would love to hear more about your experience in my comments because you would know better than I do. So if you don't know already, the Culture book, which has been around for a little over 10 years, it's a very famous book, breaks down cultural dimensions in international business into 8 different dimensions. And what I found to be the most interesting, or one of the most interesting points, was that Meyer distinguishes a different scale of communication from evaluating. So communication, she classifies kind of as how people just talk day to day. I mean, even though it's in a business context, but she distinguishes that from evaluating, which is where people give feedback. And so I found that really interesting because like all books out there, Erin Meyer at first talks about how Americans are very low context, as in we're very direct, we don't beat around the bush, we don't rely on contextual cues as much as people who are in high context cultures. An example she gives of a high context culture would be places like France, Brazil, China, Japan, etc. Though, of course, to varying degrees. They're not all the same level of high context. Erin Meyer is also American, and she says that we are a low context culture. We are direct, and she credits this to, one, us having a very short history. As I say, we're the world's teenager. So we don't have a very long shared history. We also are 98% immigrants or descendants of immigrants. So we don't have the same long history that other cultures, especially in Asia, have, where they have more shared understandings and cultural assumptions. We don't have that. But this, calling Americans low context, has always driven me a little crazy as someone from a blue collar area and who's also neurodivergent, because in white collar spaces, especially once you get to more elite universities, firms, etc., they're very indirect. And my research has showed that I'm not the only one who's experienced that. I interviewed 64 Black and white women and men for my Ph.D. dissertation. And one of the biggest themes was they were all like, as I moved up, people talk more and more in circles. What is going on with that? It's built a scale and validated that on hundreds of more people. And again, that keeps coming up. That's one of the number one problems my clients have is, I'm American, I've lived here my whole life, but why are they beating around the bush in corporate? And I made several videos on why this is a class distinction. So what I found really interesting was that Meyer talks about how the communication scale is not the same as the evaluation scale. Americans are direct until it's time to give feedback. And she says this is something that's unique in American culture because a lot of cultures that are indirect in their communication are still indirect in how they deliver feedback. This is where a lot of the Asian countries, according to her, fall into that side of the scale. However, Americans are direct in their language day to day, but they put a lot of sugar on the feedback. She says she was always taught the rule of give 3 compliments for every negative. I was never taught that rule, but again, blue collar, small town, neurodivergent. Her work is looking between cultures. I have so far looked within cultures, so I would love to expand abroad. So if you're interested, hit me up. A big distinction between corporate indirectness and why it's so confusing for Americans and there perhaps isn't the same confusion in Asia, though again, I can't say from firsthand experience, is that we are direct until we're giving feedback and then it shifts. I would make the argument that there are still class differences there. As I've said many times, when you are in a blue-collar environment, you cannot be indirect because mistakes could cost you your life. In culture, everything is relative. So yes, someone in China or Japan might still be more indirect, even if they are blue-collar. But again, they're working with people that they have hundreds of years of shared experience within their lineage. And that doesn't mean that there's never any confusion. I would love to collaborate with some Chinese, Japanese researchers and look into how this plays out, but that hasn't happened for me yet. Maybe when I'm there in March. But a member of my school community did join the live coaching session this past week, and she was originally from Brazil, but is currently living in Germany. Brazil is high context compared to Germany, which is notoriously low context. And she talked about how her family was all working class. Her dad was a metal worker, and she said, we couldn't be indirect even though we were in high context culture, because my dad could literally lose a hand doing what he's doing. So yeah, I learned to be more direct. And even in Germany, a low context culture, she was learning, and she was in grad school and academia, that she still had to learn to be more indirect even in Germany because, again, the class and status differences. According to Meyer, who is married to a French man, has worked in France and speaks French, so seems pretty credible, that the French are the opposite of the Americans. They have high context day to day, but their evaluating when they give feedback is very direct and to the point. And she gave examples of clients she's worked with who had some trouble transitioning and realizing when they were getting negative feedback from Americans, because Americans were so indirect about it and smushed it with so many compliments that they didn't pick up on that they needed to improve some of their work. In that case, you have a culture of French people who typically think of Americans as lacking subtlety, and she'd say her clients would say this: Americans are not subtle. What is the deal? Like, why aren't they telling me this directly? And that's because the evaluation system of communication is different. Now, Meyer also talks about other dimensions that are important when you talk about communicating and decision making, such as hierarchy and how decisions are made. That's one of her skills. Now, in my research, I call the unwritten rule of compliance when you're not allowed to disagree with people in power, even if they seem like they're asking you. And this is, again, really hard for people from working class backgrounds because there is a lot of pressure usually for that work ethic and to telling the truth. And also, again, higher risk jobs. So people don't want things to go wrong. They don't want people to get hurt. While when there's a power discrepancy, more of a power discrepancy, I mean, there's always power discrepancies at work. But when you move up, you can find that people are more indirect, beat around the bush, and don't want to be disagreed with. This is what I call the unwritten rule of compliance. But Meyer talks about the dimensions of how some cultures are top-down decision cultures and some are not. Some are more consensus building. And while Japan, for example, she says is very hierarchical, has a lot of the deep respect for authority and your elders culture, they do consensus building and they start with the lower levels and they build up. And so while your leader is ultimately going to make a decision, they do it after everybody has already provided input. This is all according to her. Haven't worked in Japan. Now in the US, we don't do that. Your boss has the say, it's top down, and they make a decision. But she talked about how that decision can change. She calls it the little d, while in Japan, once they make a decision, it's pretty like solid. She says that's with more of a capital D decision. Here's the thing though, is while Americans' bosses can change their mind and their decisions aren't always final, as you move up and power imbalances get as insane as they are, where we have CEOs making 257 times or whatever it is, I think it's almost at 300 times that their employees make, there's such a huge power imbalance that people don't speak up for fear of losing their jobs and shattering fragile egos. And also people who've been really successful tend to not listen to feedback as easily. They think they have cracked the code and figured it out and everything's going to work out for them from now on. I've made several videos over the last year about how research has shown that entrepreneurs who are very successful like the first time, they're not usually successful the second time. Like there is a luck factor in there, as well as that when you haven't been successful yet, you seek feedback and people give you honest feedback. Once you've been successful, like Steve Jobs, now people don't give you as much feedback, both out of fear and because they also think you cracked the code and you know what you're doing. So then the next venture, you don't get as much feedback even if you are asking. Steve Jobs' case, this was the blunder of the money he spent on the Segway because nobody really cared. It can be hard to even notice, and one of the funniest examples of this was in the Careless People book that came out earlier this year. The former Meta executive shared that Mark Zuckerberg didn't realize that everyone let him win, and when they played, I forget what game it was, but he had no idea because people didn't disagree with him to that point. So there you go, there's a little history and context on the difference between class indirectness, corporate indirectness, and Eastern versus Western indirectness. It's the kind of stuff we discuss on this page and in my school. Hopefully you understand a little why it might be confusing and why it's not the same thing to be indirect in a culture that is indirect all the time versus indirect somewhere where it's not as evenly distributed. And if you are from one of these more indirect places, I'm interested to hear if you also perceive any class differences or if it changes, how much it changes at work versus in your day-to-day life. See some of you at book club. Bye.